All right, everyone, welcome back. We are looking at Sweet Smell of Success. Hopefully you've just seen the film or you saw it earlier prior to watching this video. If you haven't seen it, go watch the film. Let's take a look at some of the themes. What are some of the things that this film is really about? Now, the things we're going to discuss here are never explicitly mentioned, except perhaps briefly, like, for example, depression. Remember, towards the end, Sydney tells JJ about Susan, that she is depressed. So depression is part of what this film is about. It's just like this deeper sadness. She probably is even clinically depressed, not just sad. You probably also picked up on an important theme, which is sexual obsession. If the film were made today, it would be more explicit. If you haven't noticed, JJ has a thing about his sister, obviously. Is he abusing her? We don't know. Is he manipulative towards her? Absolutely. The film does hint heavily, at least about the obsession, and it leaves it open to question about incest and abuse. A major theme in this film is that of manliness. Men like gorillas pounding their chests at each other, trying to show off to be more masculine. Who's more of a man? Dallas and JJ facing off over Susan. That was just a chest beating competition. I want to emphasize that just because something is in a movie, it doesn't mean that's a theme of the film. Themes are present throughout the entire film, and they sort of capture what the film is about. So if I asked you, for example, is The Graduate about manipulation? Well, there's manipulation in The Graduate. In other words, Mrs. Robinson does manipulate Benjamin, but is the film about manipulation? No. It's about his alienation from his family and society at large. Ambition is a theme. You notice throughout the whole film, it's all about getting ahead. And this film really captures that kind of brutal win at all costs approach. Clearly, there is a thread of blackmail, threats, innuendo, and smears. Innuendo basically means rumors, suggestions, nasty suggestions about people. Okay, this was part of the era that Americans were living in at the time, which is the McCarthy era, which is the era of the blacklists, the McCarthy Army hearings, where Joseph McCarthy, Senator Joseph McCarthy, would subpoena people in Hollywood and force them to rat out their colleagues for being communists. There is freedom of thought and freedom of expression in this country. But Senator Joseph McCarthy used his position as a demagogue to damage and destroy people's lives and careers. How did he do it? Blackmail, threats, innuendo, and smears. Humiliation, that's a theme, how people are humiliated through out-of-control manliness. Another theme is the way people talk. So what we have is called the ricochet effect in three-way exchanges. It's like we'll pretend we're talking to someone, but we're actually directing what we're saying to someone else in a kind of a secret code way. So there are lots of instances in this film where the dialogue is overlapping and you see one character speaking to one person, but actually talking to someone else. Another theme, which I already discussed, which is McCarthy-like manipulation of the press and the blacklist. Publishing the things that are not true, lies and rumors. And the blacklist means once you're accused of being a communist or of being a pothead smoking marijuana, which at the time was considered to be very taboo, no one would hire you. I'd like to also take a look at the way Susan is treated. We talked about her, that she is not a femme fatale. She is, in fact, a victim. And we can see here, according to James Naremore, so when I put those quotes in, I'm using other people's, other film critics' ideas here. He talks about her being boxed in by men. She's always kind of crowded in. She's only 19. She's clinically depressed. Her brother is sexually obsessed with her. Poor girl. She's a victim here. And as James Naremore says, she is forced into silence. She's not allowed to talk by contests between the men around her. And I'm thinking specifically, of course, of the amazing television studio face-off between JJ and Dallas. I promised that we would talk about dialogue, and the dialogue, how did the filmmakers get around the limitation of not being allowed to use actual obscenities in the film? Well, one of the ways they did it, and this is absolutely brilliant, in their dialogue there were certain motifs. Clifford Odets, his references to animal characters was all over the place. People were called shrimps, or louses, or poodles, or snakes. There were instances when somebody said, every dog will have a day, or the cat's in the bag and the bag's in the river. So we have a combination of violence, right? The cat's in the bag and the bag's in the river. And we also have a reference to animals, violence. The imagery here is so violent. Watch me run a 40-yard dash with my legs cut off. And he's trying to do something with a handicap, so to speak. Another example is, you'll be able to play marbles with his eyes. I mean, what an extraordinary phrase, but so violent, so graphic. Remember when JJ said, if Sidney ever tried anything with my sister, I'd break a baseball bat over his head. And that's his friend, right? The language is very violent. That way you get around the need to use the F word and all the other obscenities that, come so easily nowadays. Another one is food. You'll notice there were multiple examples. A really good example is, you're a cookie full of arsenic. Finally, there are quite a few biblical motifs. You remember when Tony Curtis does this, right? Kind of creates a cross and says, go thou and sin no more. Or he says things like, go in peace. He sounds like the Pope. He used animal motifs, violence, food, and biblical motifs. And a lot of the dialogue, it doesn't sound the way people speak, but because of their rat-a-tat-tat delivery, their rapid-fire delivery, it sounds like New York talk. It sounds the way that people actually speak. This film, Sweet Smell of Success, challenges and bends the rigid censorship of the time. How does it do so? And you'll remember that the Hays Code, which was also known as the Production Code, which was a censorship board that all films had to be submitted to before they were approved. The Production Code around this time is becoming liberalized. And Sweet Smell of Success is one of those first films that successfully bends the rules. How? How does it do so? Well, one of the reasons it does so is because foreign films had nudity. Television was getting a greater and greater share of the audience. So if Hollywood wanted to keep its ticket sales high, it needed to make movies for grown-ups with actual grown-up situations, language, sex, violence, that would appeal to grown-ups. Because if you keep couples in separate beds and everyone sounds like a square, then you're not going to attract very much of an audience. So the Production Code was being challenged because of foreign films and television, so they started to bend the rules a little bit, and we can see examples of that in this film. Two really good examples are, of course, Otis Elwell sleeping with the cigarette girl at Tony Curtis's behest, so she's basically pimped out. Another example is, you were not allowed in films at the time to allow a crime to be committed and not to be punished. What's a good example of that? Well, the corrupt cop, right? Remember the corrupt cop at the end? He gets away with being corrupt. You were allowed to show corrupt cops, but you weren't allowed to show them not getting caught. And in this film, the corrupt cops get away with being corrupt. So you can see how this film starts to bend the rules a little bit. So by 10 years from now, the rules are bent even more, and eventually the Hays Production Code disappears. Now we're going to take a look at some visuals, and we're going to discuss how visual language works in this film. So I'd like to start with a discussion of the crab dolly. I want you to see this very small but important instance of how a film puts us in a character's place and visually keeps us connected to the characters. So let's take a look. Here, JJ is arguing with Sidney.
A favor? The day I can't get along without a press agent's handouts, I'll close up shop and move to Alaska lock, stock, and barrel.
Sweep out my igloo. Here I come.
Look, Manny, you rode in here on the senator's shirt tail, so shut your mouth.
Now, come, JJ. That's a little too harsh. Anyone seems fair game for you tonight?
This man is not for you, Harvey. And you shouldn't be seen in public with him, because that's another part of a press agent's life. They dig up scandal about prominent people and shovel it thin among columnists who give them space.
There seems to be some illusion here that escapes me.
We're friends, Harvey. We go as far back as when you were a fresh kid congressman, don't we?
Why is it that everything you say sounds like a threat?
Maybe it's a mannerism, because I don't threaten friends. But why furnish your enemies with ammunition? You're a family man, Harvey, and someday, God willing, you may want to be president. And here you are, out in the open, where any hep person knows that this one is toting that one around for you.
Wow. So he said his piece. What does that mean? We have the senator. All right. So who is she? Well, obviously she's his mistress, and he's being seen in public with his mistress. And not only is he with his mistress, she is with her agent or her manager. JJ appears to be giving the senator advice. He's acting more powerful than the senator himself, and he probably is more powerful than the senator. He's giving him advice. Okay? So first he tells the manager to shut up. Then he talks to the senator. Okay, notice what happened. The camera turned around. Now, in order to make this one small, simple shot, they needed to take down everything that was behind him and put the camera and lights and a dolly track, as well as a giant metal dolly on which the camera operator sits, and point the camera in the opposite direction over JJ's shoulder. Now, whose point of view are we looking at this scene from? We're looking at it from JJ's point of view. And it's going to make a point. We're going to see things from JJ's point of view. He's saying we're this one because he's not saying who. He's just looking. Notice where he's looking. He's looking at the manager. So he's saying where any HEP, which is HEP, at the time that meant hip, where any hip or in the know, intelligent person knows that this one
Is toting that one
is toting that one
around for you.
Boom. Such a small and simple shot, but it pulls us into the narrative. Notice how the camera moves.
This one is toting.
Do you see how simultaneously the camera moves and pans? Okay. What does that shot do? It simulates his head movement and his eye movement. In other words, it's almost like putting us inside of JJ's head. This one is toting that one around for you. Let's watch it one last time. But it's in slow motion. Here we go.
That this one is toting that.
That's an example of subjective camera. When you turn the camera around and put it where the character is, and we see what the character sees, and in this case, the genius of the move is that it mimics the character's own movements, it helps us identify with that naked aggression that JJ is directing towards all three of those people. Let's take a look at some other examples. One is a new word that I want you to learn, and that is mise-en-scène. Now, mise-en-scène is a word you'll encounter again and again in this class, in films in general. What is mise-en-scène? Objects or locations in the shot that provide important contextual information for the story. So let's take a look at this shot, for example. What is important in this shot? Well, we can see, for example, that she's wearing a fur coat. And we can see the background is New York at night. That's mise-en-scène. It's objects or locations in the shot that give us information about the story. Another way to think of mise-en-scène is composition, the arrangement of objects or people in the shot. This information, the composition, will tell us important story information, sometimes in a subtle and unconscious way. Here's an example of mise-en-scène. What's in the shot? Well, this sign is in the shot. What does that sign tell us about JJ? Is he far along in his career? No. It's taped. His name is literally taped with Scotch tape to the window. So that's an example of mise-en-scène. This sign says everything that we need to know. Another example of visual language is juxtaposition, and that's what we call contrast. Okay? Juxtaposition is placing two things that are dramatically different next to each other. Well, what's the only other thing in the shot that is placed next to the sign? His suit. So you notice that where is he putting his money into? Into a nice suit. We can see the contrast between a sign which tells us that he's not a success financially, but his suit tells us that he's definitely trying. So we can start to see here how much information the film conveys to us in a non-obvious kind of way. Another example of mise-en-scène is his office. What's the main information that we get from this shot? Right here, right? You open up the door in his office and it's his bedroom. This mise-en-scène tells us a lot about where he is in his career. This is JJ in the foreground and Sydney in the background. So already we have some mise-en-scène that tells us that this character is much smaller than this character. JJ here dominates the shot. But the camera is also below his eye level, and it's pointing to his eyes. So the camera is in a tilt-up position. The lens is a wide-angle lens, which means it's giving us a lot of context around him. It's got a wide angle of view. And you'll notice the lighting is directly overhead, like The Godfather, if you remember. This is probably where the cinematographer and director of The Godfather got that idea of always filming Marlon Brando with lighting from above to create this hooded look over his eyes. So this creates a sense of mystery. The tilt-up creates a sense of dominance. The wide-angle lens allows Tony Curtis to be smaller in the frame, and the overhead lighting puts dark shadows over his eyes. And I want to talk to you about this idea of wide-angle versus telephoto zoom. We talked about telephoto zoom in The Graduate. There was the shot where he was running towards the church. With the wide-angle lens, which is similar to the ones that we have on our smartphone, you get more distortion. If you hold the phone up to your face and you take a picture like a selfie, you actually don't look like that. If you've ever not liked the way you look in a selfie, it's because of the wide-angle characteristics of the lens. The best way to get a portrait or a shot taken of you is to use a telephoto zoom lens, or just to stand farther back and then zoom in. Wide-angle lenses, generally speaking, create a kind of a mild fisheye effect, which means there's distortion around the edges, and if you put it in someone's face, it even distorts their face because the center bulges out and the sides kind of roll off and they look like a fisheye. It kind of rounds it out. Using a wide-angle lens, you can see more, which means if you can see more, you have more information in the shot. An important characteristic of the wide-angle lens is that it is capable of deep focus. You can create everything in the shot, even in the deep background. Telephoto zoom is pretty much the exact opposite. So instead of distortion, you have more even distribution. So that means the elements in the frame are not distorted. Okay, you have a much narrower angle of view. Because you are zoomed in on something, you're looking at something that's very, very specific. Which means because you're looking at something specific, you have less background information in the shot. And an important characteristic of telephoto zoom is, we mentioned this last week, and I'm going to go into a little more depth on this now, is that these lenses are capable of something that is called shallow depth of field. Shallow depth of field is the opposite of deep focus. If deep focus shows you everything in focus, shallow depth of field focuses a sharp focus on one object and areas of soft focus or out of focus on others. So some objects are in focus, other objects are not. They are blurry, soft, or out of focus. When we change focus there, we're racking focus, we're using shallow depth of field because we can change the focus from one person to the other person. In order to be able to do that, you need a telephoto zoom lens and shallow depth of field. So how does this look in the camera? Well, over here we have a really wide angle. I'll put the camera here and the lens there. And if you actually look at this photo close up, everything here is going to be in focus. Here's pretty much a random example of an Ansel Adams photograph. These majestic views of the American West, Yosemite and other areas like that. The kind of lens that he's using here is going to be a wide angle lens, and he's got very, very deep focus. If we take this shot and we use a 24mm lens, we're actually seeing a little bit less. Let's come down to the 300. If you put a 300mm lens on the camera in this position, in the same position, you can actually see that little red house over there. Let's take a look at an example of this on a human. All right. If you point a wide-angle lens, again, we're using it as example, a 24mm lens, and you get it up in someone's face, get close to them, look at how much distortion you're creating. Okay. That is not how she looks. 50mm, she's still somewhat distorted. If I put an 85mm lens on, then she starts to look more like herself. The most flattering focal length you can use for a portrait, certainly fashion photographers will use these, is a 200mm lens. How does this affect us? Because when you use a wide-angle lens, right, you're not going to use it like this in a movie, but you might use it a little bit more like this. Right? That looks a little more dominant and scary than that. That's what the cinematographer did in Sweet Smell of Success. That in this shot, we are using a wide-angle lens. We're also using a wide-angle lens in this shot. Okay? But we're bringing the camera very close to the subject. JJ is an aggressive, dominant character. We want to film him in a way that makes him look intimidating. Here we're back with the idea of mise-en-scène. And what jumps out, what information in this shot jumps out at you? Obviously, it's this picture. Notice where it's placed in the frame. We can't miss it. JJ's at his desk, and he has a large, weird portrait of his sister on his table. The objects in the shot give us information. This is a sequence of shots, how the shot sizes. We have a wide shot, so we can see the context, and we see these three men surrounding this woman. Then, when Dallas talks, we see Dallas from Susan's point of view, looking up, right? Look at how the camera is below his eye line. His eye line is up here, we're down here, looking up, which creates a sense of dominance on the part of Dallas and subservience on the part of Susan. The same thing here. He's basically forcing her to shut up. Look at how this tilt-up shot. It looks like he's talking down to us. And then, from the men's point of view, the tilt down. Humiliated, marginalized, the tilt down. Finally, for our last shot, what's the mise-en-scène information? In this shot, she stands a little taller in the frame. We're over his shoulder, but she's not closed in. We see her full-bodied, standing tall, facing him down. What other mise-en-scène information is in the shot? Where's her fur coat? She's not wearing it. Almost in every shot in the film, she's wearing the fur coat that JJ bought her. This time, she's not. She's wearing her own old coat, and she's leaving. On that note, I will leave you, and you can continue working on the rest of the module. Thank you.